Right, I think we'll admit everyone in. Okay, I think we'll give it a few minutes to let everyone in. Yeah, everyone who's joined, if you want to say who you are in the chat and where you're joining us from, that'd be awesome. Yeah, let's give it a few more minutes. Then we'll get started. Do you know what? We'll just start now. Why not? Okay, so welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. It's great to have so many people join us tonight. Like I just said, if you'd like to introduce yourself, where you're from, and yeah, who you are, that'd be wonderful. If anyone doesn't know, my name is Niall. I'm the founder of the Working Class Economist Group. The Working Class Economist Group is an organisation to highlight and connect working class voices the world over in economics and to get economics speaking about class once again. As I'm pretty sure you'll know by now, tonight's webinar will be on class and climate. Like I said, our last panel on class and climate at the end of last year was such a good discussion and left us loads of great questions. We've decided that we'll give it another shot. So fortunately today, we've got three great speakers who I'm super excited to have with us. First, we have Emma River-Roberts, who is a working class environmentalist and focuses on everything degrowth in the working class. If you haven't had time to read Emma's great blog post she did for us on degrowth, do read it. I'll probably post it in the chat. Next up, we'll have John Barry, who is a professor of green political economy at Queen's University of Belfast. John is interested and researches post-growth economics, sustainability, and low carbon transitions. And finally, we've had Asad Rehman, who is the director of War and Want, who are an anti-poverty charity challenging the root causes of poverty, inequality, and injustice through partnerships with social movements in the global south. Prior to War and Want, Asad has been working in the non-government and charity sector for 25 years, pushing for climate, racial, economic, and social justice. So a bit of a rundown of how things are going to go tonight. Each panelist is going to be speaking for about 10 to 15 minutes, and there'll be a short Q&A after. So during the event, do get your questions in using in the chat, and we'll try and get through as many of them as possible, and we'll be hopefully finishing up around 8 o'clock. Finally, if you want to tweet about the event, feel free to do so. We'll use the hashtag climate and class, and feel free to tag us so we can share the discussion with others. So without further ado, take it away, Emma.
Thank you. So a quick thing about me is I used to be very heavily involved in mainstream environmental movements. I ended up leaving for many reasons. One of the big issues being that the working class were almost always pushed to the sidelines. And what frustrated me is that I knew what the issues were, but I didn't know why. So when I left, I started looking at movement building from a behavioural perspective. So looking to understand how and why we build social networks with some and not with others, understanding what makes people's brains tick and all things like that. And I ended up going back to uni to do it in a slightly more formalised setting. And I focused my efforts on how working class communities mobilise and take progressive forms of environmental action in the UK. And then looking at the viability of scaling these practices up elsewhere within other communities. So my use of mobilisation, or mobilisation in this sense, refers to how people are able to influence local or potentially national policies to become more environmentally progressive and things like that. But what makes this incredibly difficult is that working class forms of environmentalism are hard to find because our efforts often lack visibility. It's harder to have our voices recognised in mainstream environmental spaces, and we don't have access to the same funds and networks that many of the middle class do. And when we do enter their spaces, we're often not taken seriously or listened to. And as a result, we've fallen prey to misrepresentation. And in discussions relating to the climate crisis, we're often spoken through like the lens of decline, loss of us being like incapable, ignorant about environmental issues. And it's reproduced this stereotype that we need to be helped, educated and saved, which legitimizes the notion that it's okay to speak up on behalf of us because we're incapable of doing so for ourselves. Now, this is something that environmental movements led by the middle class do a lot of the time still. And what's also problematic is that in most cases, when you join these movements, there's an underlying expectation that you'll follow their existing practices, existing goals, ways of expressing discontent and so on, all of which have been designed through this middle class lens. And it's incredibly rare for people to be willing to alter these practices to be more inclusive towards our class faction. We know this from personal testimonies. Research shows this occurring time and time again. And in addition to that, there is no empirical evidence that environmental movements led by the middle class have ever been able to attract a notable working class base in recent history. It's failed every single time in the past. We therefore have every reason to expect it to fail every single time again in the future. Now, rewriting history is always possible, but we don't have the time. So going down the road of trying to bring in a large working class base into these middle class led movements is counterproductive. And what we need is to take an entirely different approach. Now, we should always, of course, always welcome people into our spaces and vice versa, but it won't be achieved at scale, not a chance. Now, I never want to create like an us and them mentality. I'd very much like the working and middle class to have a stronger sense of unity than they do now. But in order to achieve this, we've got to have our own spaces and our own autonomous groups where our visions are created through our own class lens, because our class cultures are so fundamentally different. It impacts absolutely everything that we do, including how we prefer to structure our organizations, how we prefer to communicate, perhaps what we feel are the most pressing issues. So even with the best of intentions, no amount of reading or learning about class theory or research can create that level of understanding that we obtain through our own lived experiences. So by creating autonomous grassroots movements designed around our own identities and customs, that then gives us scope to work together across class factions and groups. So both groups working side by side, rather than competing within a single organisation to have our perspectives heard and recognised. So we need a little bit of space from each other in order to work together across class factions to achieve the same common goals. And all of us want an economy that benefits everyone across the global north and south, not an economy that just benefits the few. And all of us want to live a life within planetary boundaries. So we want the same things. Now, we do have existing established and visible organisations, working class ones, especially within the socialist movement, which is great. But we also need to draw focus towards other grassroots movements that are working to help reshape the environment and economy for the better. So what I've decided to do is to create a grassroots organisation, which will be, I think, officially launching around sometime October, called the Working Class Climate Alliance, or WCCA. And what we'll be doing is we'll be highlighting what working class forms of grassroots-led environmentalism look like. So what actions people are taking in their respective communities to make life more sustainable and equitable. Now, we won't be aligning with any political party or alternative to the current economic system, so things like degrowth or socialism, because if we're thinking along the lines of building a mass movement capable of transformative change, then we need to create a network of people from all walks of life and perspectives. But at the same time, we'll also be highlighting not just what they're doing, but how they did it. What steps did they take? What resources did they use? What did they wish they knew before they started out? What went well? What didn't? And understanding this is key because it provides signposts for things that people may need to consider when mobilising that they might not have thought of. And it will hopefully give people the confidence to try again if something doesn't quite work out the way they intended it to. Because when things don't work out as intended, we often feel if it's indicative of our own inadequacy and that we're not cut out for whatever we're doing. So by showing the bumps in the road, it really normalises the fact that everyone experiences them to some degree. So by identifying and working with these separate communities, we'll be able to create a network of working class grassroots movements in the UK. We'll be sharing the stories through the organisation itself, creating members groups for people to connect with each other, share stories and tips. And this will be done remotely because it allows for a rapid scaling up in an accessible manner. So it's a very quick way to start building a movement. And it also provides a space for people to come and create these networks and build solidarity with our own kind, even if for whatever reason they can't take any action themselves. Now, we do hope to go out and spend time with as many people as possible, because it's always nice to get to know people in person. But the extent to which we can do this is very speculative, owing to time, logistical and financial constraints, and I'm broke, so it's on a shoestring budget. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly now turn to the incredible work that's being done by a community benefit society in Burslem in Stoke, some of whom I've recently met, and I'm really looking forward to working with them as part of the WCCA, and I think some might be here, so hello if you are. And it was established to create an alternative economy driven through a bottom-up approach. So through the collaboration of people who are best placed to advise what's needed and how it needs to be done, because there's no one better placed to advise on what needs to change in a given area than by the very people themselves. Now, I'm just going to highlight a little bit of their work. I'd really like to talk about it all, but then I'd end up hijacking the rest of this webinar and I get in trouble. So hopefully I can do it justice with the time that I have left. So they've outlined a plan that focuses on waste in all its forms, highlighting how waste represents market failure. And through this theme, they've identified 10 types and categorized them, setting out ways that they can be eliminated. So I'll give a couple of examples, one of which is the waste of resources, such as people's time. And remediating this entails working with others to create work that's actually meaningful. And in terms of physical space that's wasted, such as vacant buildings or derelict land, they seek to become a vehicle to broker, enable and or deliver the reuse of these buildings and lands. And when it comes to wasted talent, so all of the artists and creatives, they're underexposed, they're underappreciated. They aim to create a platform designed to secure patrons and backers for these people. So it really regenerates the community in a sustainable way, but also in a social way as well, and in an economic way. It's wonderful. And they've identified different prospective funding sources, such as crowdfunding, philanthropic donations, social investment through community shares. And it is so tangible what they're doing. So they were invited for a meeting by the new leader of the Stoke City Council, and the council seems really keen to support their work, and they're currently negotiating for a partnership of some sort. But it's not just Burslem that this has the potential to benefit. They also really want to empower and inspire communities to take action elsewhere based off what they're doing. So through all of this, through the WCCA's collaboration with grassroots movements, we can create a shared identity, mutual solidarity, support and respect. And what we can do is we can show not just that making change is possible, but we can also show how. And everything that we do, because it's rooted in class consciousness and pride, we're really trying to reignite that because it's been absolutely decimated, which I'm sure virtually everyone here is aware of. And it's been observed time and time again that when we know our efforts have an impact, when we see people like us creating that impact, when we know what it is we need to do to get involved, and when we can be a part of a supportive social network of people from a similar or identical background to ourselves, we're far more likely to take that plunge and get involved ourselves, which in turn provides us with the necessary social preconditions for the mass mobilisation of the working class. And that's it from me. I'll pass over to the wonderful John.
That's brilliant, Emma. Brilliant to hear of the Working Class Climate Alliance. I think more than ever, we're going to need these links between the red and the green. So thanks, Niall, for the invitation and welcome to everybody. Greetings from the other islands where I am in the occupied north for some people, the 6 counties, Northern Ireland. We can't really figure out what to call this place I live in. And I'm going to begin with some quotes just to orientate yourself. And forgive me if some of these may be very familiar to you. In fact, they may have even come up in part one of this podcast. But one is the wonderful Chico Mendes quote, which many of you will probably know. Ecology without class struggle is just gardening. Another one is that it's hard to think about the end of the world when you can't think about getting to the end of the week. And then this one, I think that George Monbiot, the Guardian writer, apparently come up with, which I think is a really good one. Nobody in history ever rioted for austerity. And it's an important part, I think, of developing a working class politics, that it is intersectional. So while we're going to be speaking probably a lot about class, you know, we mustn't forget issues of gender, of race, of sexual identity, ableism, and so on. But particularly, I think a lot of working class people are turned off from green politics for some of the reasons Emma indicated. You know, when you hear a privileged, clipped, middle class, educated voice talking to you about the end of the world and the need to rein in your consumption, it pisses you off if you're a working class person that aspires for more. And I do think what we need to start articulating, particularly for a working class politics, is a politics of abundance. You know, not a politics of sacrifice and a politics of scarcity, because although it's a misunderstanding, and I think you should definitely read some of Emma's work on this to correct the wrong view that somehow a post-growth perspective is somehow, oh my God, we're going back to the caves. It's a recognition that we have to stay within the planetary limits, but also that we have to recognize some people in our society are not consuming enough. So I think that discourse of overconsumption, I think, can put a lot of people off because they want to have more things. And I think working class people do deserve to have more things and better things, but within the sustainable limits that the planet sets for ourselves. So I think the reason why the working class is so important, well, there's many reasons. I'll just identify two. One is that, again, to challenge the kind of green middle class politics that we get, which is all about consumption, the real focus should be on production. Who owns and controls the means of production, which is a very old socialist perspective. And that's why class matters. Your class position is not necessarily in relation to the commodities you consume, but your position in the order of production. Do you sell your labor? You know, or do you own capital? Do you have independent means of existing? The reality is the vast majority in the world have to sell their labor simply to get by, and that was what makes them the working class. So it's production that's the fundamental basis of our ecological crisis, but also the working class make up the majority in society. So therefore, for any transition, and it will not surprise you, I'm sure others on this call would agree with me, there is no capitalist solution to this crisis we're going through. I mean, I've been at this game as an academic, as an activist for over 30 years. And what we now have, which is kind of different than we had 3 decades ago, we still have very strong normative political reasons for going beyond capitalism. You know, it's exploitation, the inequality it produces, the blighted lives that it creates. But now we also have scientific reasons. You know, the science, as I read the science of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and others, we now need to transition beyond a growth-based capitalism purely largely for functional or scientific reasons. I mean, essentially, if you want a simple definition of what we're in now, it's cancer. That's what cancer is. It's growth that's now past the point where it's now harmful to the organism. So at a macro level, we now need to start figuring out a post-growth economy, but one that should not be interpreted as meaning every sector of the economy has to collapse. It is about saying which bits of the economy do we want to grow, asking ourselves those very pertinent questions. Isn't it funny there's always money for war and not for the NHS? That governments in the West could find millions to send to Vladimir Zelensky in his war against Russia, but we now can't fix our housing system and so on. So the issue is a political one about which bits of our economy do we need to grow, the renewable energy sector, which of course from a class position is great, but we need to recognize that the evidence is that it's fairly low unionized sectors like that as well. We want good, decent jobs in the green economy and not just naively thinking that moving away from coal, oil and gas to renewable energy is necessarily going to be the whole solution. It's necessary, but insufficient. So I do think we have to focus on production, and we also have to focus on inequality. I mean, there's a great report that got a lot of media coverage that it was done by, I don't know, it was Concern or it wasn't Friends of the Earth or some other NGO that looked at the class composition of the greenhouse gas emissions, both globally and within societies. And roughly speaking, you know, nearly 50% of greenhouse gases are created by 10% of people. So it's the rich. We simply cannot afford the rich, purely ecologically now, never mind politically and any other way. And I think we can generate a more populist working class support for green politics if it's not about a politics of austerity, if it's not about a politics of everybody having to tighten their belt, will be correctly identify those in society that are living way beyond their fair share of the planet's resources. And I think then we begin to start getting more popular working class support for green politics. And the reality is that this politics of abundance that I'm talking about is going to be based upon, in my view, I'll just give two principles of what I'm talking about here, which I think can generate support from socialists and those with a class analysis. One is the socialization of consumption. You say, Mother of God, what's he talking about that of a Monday evening? What I mean by that are things like libraries, public state provision of healthcare. For those of you who know a little bit of that Jeremy Corbyn moment, and John MacDonald, who's probably the greatest chancellor the UK will never see, the idea of universal basic services. So this is what I mean by the socialization of consumption. And particularly, the most radical organization from a socialist point of view or an eco-socialist point of view, I think is the library, because it separates out use and enjoyment of a good or service from actually having to own it. And that library model can be extended, as we've seen in many cities, and even here in Belfast, where we're getting, tool libraries, where types of goods that we can share, that's going to be low cost or no cost, and also has, a positive environmental benefit. So I think we have to have that socialized consumption model as part of what we mean as we're moving away from a growth-based, in my view, ecocidal capitalist model that we have at the moment. The other side then, to go back to production, is that we need to democratize production. Now that can be understood in a variety of different ways. Is it democratic control like nationalization, state control? I think there is a compelling logic for things like natural monopolies, like the railway system, for example, or the electricity system. They are natural monopolies that makes no sense to be divided up and into different companies providing these services. So there's a nationalization argument in terms of how we can take democratic control over these major parts of the economy. But beyond that, then, there's also about worker cooperatives. Why should democracy end at the factory gate or the office door? There are lessons to be learned, particularly in British Labour history. If you haven't come across this already, look up the Lucas Plan from the late 70s and early 80s, where trade unions in Lucas Aerospace that was threatened with closure, when the unions democratically organized the workers to come up with how can they use the productive plant, the machines of the factories, which were making weapons, and could they come up with socially useful production? And they come up with hundreds. So when we democratize production, it's not just an old socialist idea of workers owning and controlling the means of production, which I still think is a valid one, but actually it's about, releasing innovation, which is often seen in our society as only brave entrepreneurs like that gobshite Elon Musk. I mean, he has so little faith in humanity, he wants to bugger off to Mars. That's his solution in terms of the ecological crisis. So socialize consumption, democratize production, and particularly to move beyond and try to explain in a language that lands with people why we need to move beyond capitalism and growth. One analogy is the capitalist system is like a bicycle. It goes and grows or it collapses. That's it. It only has two default positions. It has no steady state. Nothing in nature grows forever, although my tummy has probably grown a lot over COVID and since, but it's not healthy for anything to grow beyond its healthy thresholds. So capitalism is a system that is addicted to growth or capital accumulation, and therefore it cannot be sustainable on a planet that isn't growing. You know, with the exception of solar radiation that we get every day, everything that's ever happened in human society, or is likely to ever happen, has happened within the confines of the ecological living and non-living systems of the planet, which isn't growing. And what we need to do is actually decouple human well-being from economic growth, not as it's currently the case, with all these desperate attempts to what I would call biofuel the Hummer, where most policy, most political parties, most of the media, it's all about trying to find some savior technology like carbon capture and sequestration, for which we have no evidence, folks, at all, despite the billions that has been spent on this technology to try and green capitalism. In other words, to decouple capitalism and growth from greenhouse gas emissions, negative environmental impacts and resources. My proposition is, as an eco-socialist, we should be decoupling human well-being from growth itself, and therefore decoupling human well-being from capitalism. And just to begin to wind up, we've had a very testing time recently over the last couple of weeks with the devastating heat waves on 3 continents. You know, less attention, of course, was paid, as always, in our racist media to what was going on in places like China and other parts of Asia. All our attention was on these, what I would call temporary climate refugees, who are the English tourists in Corfu. And I know Asad and myself on Twitter pointed this out. In case you didn't see, it was small boats, and I use that word with all partly the toxic way in which the Tories use it. It was Greek small boats which saved those English climate refugees. Now, unlike real climate refugees, who are now going to be sent to a prison ship starting today in Britain, these folk were able to get home afterwards. But I do think it's a harbinger of things to come, where, you know, we tend to think of the climate challenge in terms of, you know, typhoons and heat waves, and will be, but actually the forced migration of millions of people is going to be part and parcel. And that's why, certainly from an eco-socialist perspective, and maybe Asad will talk about this a bit more, we have no international protections for climate refugees. They fall outside the climate protections that are already there. And an eco-socialist position must be to demand climate reparations, absolutely, because of the colonial and imperialist legacy that have caused the problems for people in the global south, but also to provide them with protection. So I'm going to leave you with the 4 Ds that I think should help structure our thoughts about class, eco-socialism, and the future that we want. I've mentioned all these in different ways. One is decarbonisation. We absolutely need to move away from coal, oil, and gas as quickly and as equitably as possible. And that's where this idea of the just transition comes in. We should actually thank those coal and oil and gas communities and workers for all the great stuff that they've helped create. They are not climate criminals. And I think often the green movement is unfairly critical of those workers in the fossil fuel sector. So we need to have a just transition away from coal, oil, and gas. As I mentioned already, we need to democratize as much as production as possible. Indeed, even as an educator in the university, I think we need to democratize education. You know, why should democracy end at the lecture room door? You know, are we in the university actually providing the knowledge, the skills, and so on that our students actually need for the world that's coming into being? We also then need to, in my view, decommodify central features of what we need to live a decent life. Healthcare, education, energy, water, housing. These are old socialist and welfare state arguments that, and I think part of the struggle we're now in, we're going to have to refight for these things that we thought we had won. So decommodification. And the last one then is decolonization. I've already mentioned that we need to recognize the long, centuries-long legacies of imperialism and colonialism, which enabled the global north in the minority world to get to the wealth and affluence that it now enjoys. And therefore, we should absolutely support every demand for climate justice and climate reparations that have been justly demanded by those countries in the global south who've done very little to contribute to the problem, and yet they are the ones who are suffering the worst impacts. But there's another area of decolonization, which I take in part from the degrowth movement, is to decolonize our imaginary. In other words, we need to start rethinking about what a future is going to be like outside capitalism. And that starts for me with absolutely challenging neoclassical economics. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but it's the dominant form of economics that structures how we hear what's on the news, on the BBC or elsewhere. It's the dominant form of economics taught in secondary school and universities. And to me, it's ideological indoctrination. It is only one understanding of the economy. It's pro-market, it's pro-capitalist, and yet presents itself as objective, neutral, and value-free. So we have to decolonize our education system, particularly from neoclassical economics. So there's my 4 Ds. I'm going to leave you with 3 words from the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, great American radical trade union movement: educate, agitate, organize. And on that last point, we need to remember the great words of Malcolm X, who quite rightly pointed out, we're not outnumbered without organized. So let's get organized.
Amazing. Thank you, John. Yeah, thanks so much. I'm sure we can dive into in the Q&A there. Yeah, so on to Asad. Let's keep it moving.
I feel like just saying what John said. So thanks, Niall, for the invitation. And I think, like many others, I would say I was a reluctant environmentalist, in the sense that I didn't come to this struggle because through the environment movement, but came through it from racial justice movements, economic justice, class struggle. And I think we have to just remember about how climate used to be framed, right? Polar bears and icebergs, how it was deliberately depoliticized in the idea, in the sense that, you know, well, you could reduce carbon without challenging the economic system. And by positing it in that way, that you could reduce carbon without reducing injustice, that somehow governments and corporations would act rationally and we'd somehow resolve or solve the climate crisis. We can all see that has been palpably untrue, right? I mean, it's not just the fact that we've seen, of course, decades, 30 to 40 years of that mantra, and we continue to see global emissions rise. We are now, you know, when the UN itself says we've exited the era of climate warming and are now in the era of climate boiling, it's just important for us to just recognize the scale of this crisis that we face, right? I mean, the all human history, as we know it, has all taken place within a stable environment, within the Holocene period, right? It's when our civilizations, the idea of cities, agriculture, all of those things took place. The development of humanity as such, and we're now, of course, exiting that. We can see that you don't need to be a climate scientist. You can see that, of course, in the pictures around the world. So I want to just maybe talk about maybe 4 things very, very briefly. First, you know, I think it's important when we come from a class perspective and understanding this in terms of the connection between class and climate, that how do we understand this crisis, right? How do we frame it? What do we believe are its root causes? And I think, you know, like John said, I think you've got to really understand it by really beginning to understand, I would argue, sort of racialized capitalism, right? The idea of an economic system which is based on exploitation and extraction, which at its heart sees certain people as being disposable. And that is largely, of course, not just black and brown people, but overwhelmingly working class people. And that's been true over the last 500 years, right? And it's accelerated, of course, during the post-industrial revolution. You could say, you know, that for most of our class, and when we talk about class, of course, our class isn't defined by the nation state, right? Our class is a global class. When we define it in that terms, we can say that the overwhelming majority of our class, i.e. people overwhelmingly in the global south and increasingly now people in the global north, have been denied the right to be able to live with dignity, right? And they've been exploited and extracted, and extraction has taken place. And that, you know, we could, if we had time, we'd talk about the logic of how it was implanted from the doctrine of discovery, how it was formed the cornerstone of slavery, legitimizes colonialism, subsequently shapes imperialism, and I would argue continues to frame how the majority of the climate crisis is talked about. And it's at so many different levels. It's not just in public narratives. Even with the IPCC, this is not to challenge the science of the IPCC, but if you look at climate modeling, right, the models that the climate scientists use, those models overwhelmingly, you know, are developed, of course, in the global north, but they assume deep inequality and injustice is a permanent feature. And so all of the modeling, for example, accept that there's going to be an overuse of things like energy in the global north, and that people in the global south won't have access to energy. It assumes that there's going to be an overuse in terms of course, material use, the growth of the global of economies, and that's going to take place in the global north, and the global south is going to be denied that. And that it shapes, for example, even this discussion about how sometimes when the scientists say, you know, we must reduce half all carbon by 2030 and be at zero by 2050, it doesn't answer, of course, the question, which should be the most important one. Well, who does that, right? What's fair and equitable? And equity and justice are important pillars for us when we look at this from a class perspective. And, you know, and I think it's important, especially now for us as political activists, because we can see, you know, John mentioned the Chico Mendes quote, but just looking at it is in terms of how it plays out in real politics, right? We see already the forces of the right weaponizing poverty versus climate, right? Suddenly found interest in the realities of the working class, right? And saying, of course, we mustn't do this because it threatens the interests of ordinary working people, makes them poorer, etc. We saw that really expressed very powerfully in the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, right? And that banner that they had at the front of their march when they protested Macron's carbon tax, they said, the elites worry about the end of the world. We ordinary people, we worry about the end of the month, right? So both from a class perspective and a political perspective, it's important for us to be able to address that. So how do we begin to address that? Well, you know, I think we should also first recognize that many of these frameworks that are being talked about now were developed by class-based movements, right? I mean, even the word just transition came out of the environmental justice movement. These were people who looked at the environment, not through the lens of environmentalism, but looked at it through the lens of race and of class. And the idea of the transition was a way to understand how particularly poor, working class, Black, brown communities were facing environmental injustices that were not being faced by middle class communities, but that the answer wasn't simply to say we must reduce or end all those toxic plants, the very plants that were giving people jobs, but then were also killing them. But it was about how do you transition not just workers, but communities and safeguard their interests. And the whole framework of just transition was developed. Now people, of course, it's very contested and there's various iterations of the just transition. Some people talk about just transition is only about workers in the fossil fuel sector. Well, of course, we think, and as rightly, that this is a transition in terms of about the economy, because fundamentally the reason we are here, where we are, standing on the edge of precipice, heading towards not a 1.5, reaching the 1.5 degree guardrail, we're currently at least heading for 3. And most climate scientists will tell you that actually we're closer to heading towards 4 and 4.5. That what we're fighting for now is about a 2.5 degree world, knowing full well what that means in terms of people's lives and livelihoods, what it means in terms of disruption of our food systems, and right down to the realities, of course, for working people on an everyday basis, right? Like, what does it mean to be working in factories when you've got 40, 50 degree heat? What does it mean for ordinary communities, which are then find themselves, of course, facing this multiple crises? Now, when I think back to the trade union movement, right, the foundation of the trade union movement, it set itself two goals. Said, we're about protecting workers under the existing system, but also fighting to achieve a world where the economy and society was controlled for the benefit of workers or working people or of the working class. And that is really, really important for us to have that as a cornerstone. Secondly, of course, as John said, our understanding of the climate crisis, of this permanent crisis, is not simply seen through the lens of carbon. It's about the interconnecting crisis, right? About climate, and we know that that's we have to have a fair share response. That would mean, obviously, for those who have been following the climate science, you would be saying the UK needed to not only fully decarbonize by 2030, but would also have to pay climate reparations just for the fact that it's overconsumption. Jason Hickel has calculated that at 4.4 trillion pounds. Now, that of course doesn't take into account the trillions that have been taken through slavery and colonialism, imperialism, extraction. There's been another figure that in Nature Science that calculates that at something like about 150 trillion since 1960. So not just a historical, and we all probably remember the figure put forward by Indian academics, 45 trillion looted from India alone. And that wasn't just simply, it's useful for us to think about these things, because that 45 trillion pounds that was taken out of India during the British Raj, which took India's share of GDP from 24% to 4%, wasn't simply about the fact that this was money that was taken out or resources that were taken away. It's interesting how intrinsic it was to the expansion of capitalism. It said that capitalist expansion into all the new economy, the new world economies, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States, was fueled and paid for by this extraction of wealth and resources from the global south. And of course, the famous Marxist Walter Rodney talks about how the global south has developed the global north. It's never been the global north that developed the global south. Now, that leads us to recognizing these crises. And of course, there's climate crisis, but there's also a crisis of inequality and of poverty, right? And that at a global level, we know half the world still is in real poverty, not this $1.95, but in real poverty, earning less than the equivalent of $5.50. If we wanted to end poverty globally, we'd be talking about a rate of about $15 a day that people would need, that just to have a basic lifestyle. And of course, we know in the reality in this country, we've got 17 million people in poverty, the majority of them in work poverty, 4 million children growing up in poverty. We recognize the reality of this economic system, as John was pointing out, interestingly now, I think for working class people here in the global north, it's been the structural adjustment programs of neoliberalism that have been weighted on the global south for the last few decades is now being revisited, is being visited on the global north. We see the exact same model happening in the deregulation of the labor economy, the attack on trade union rights, the weakening of the social protection, the idea that, of course, it's working people or poor people who carry the can. And we saw that, of course, during austerity, which was a political decision. But it's not just those two. When we think about the planetary limits, and planetary limits are important for us as socialists to understand, because we're currently, I think, breaching 5 out of the 9. Some people say we're breaching 7 out of the 9 planetary limits. And what green capitalism, or the solutions of capitalism, are talking about actually fuel even more of that. I mean, I think the OECD said we need to reduce our overall material use to about 50 billion tons. Currently, the OECD predicts we're going to be up about 162 or 168 billion tons. On every metric, as this economic system is taking us over the edge. And that, of course, all goes back to the primary function of our economy at the moment is profit accumulation, right? Profit accumulation for, of course, the minority, the few, the 1%, or whatever we want to talk about it. But there are also understanding these systems, and of course, we would say, you know, in its modern expression, that's neoliberalism, but we could go back on and on and on. And those are, of course, baked into our economic and political systems. And we know we have to undo those. But interestingly, and I think John touches on this, interestingly, you don't have to be ideological now to come to this perspective. The IPCC very, very clearly said, you know, the vulnerabilities that exist between the global north and the global south, 17 times more vulnerability between the south and the north, are as a consequence of systems of injustice, including colonialism, both past and present. Why it says that the only way to solve the climate crisis is you need a compact on poverty and climate. That's the only way that you're going to be able to resolve it, both from to build the social support for it, but also because actually all of the solutions that we've historically talked about in terms of addressing inequality and injustice economically are the very same solutions that are needed in terms of building communities' resilience. So it talks about you need universal public services. It talks about the experience of COVID and COVID pandemic and the vaccine apartheid, and says we need actual global solidarity and cooperation. You need to look at trade, tax and debt. You need to look at how the global economy is structured. You need to guarantee people wages. You need to guarantee people social protection. These determine the realities of your experience of now the inevitable climate violence. Of course, the scale of it is what we're fighting about, but it's not something we're fighting for about in the future. It's already here. And that is really, really important, because I think it, as John says, it leads you to, when you begin to understand you need to transition, you know, the energy system, for example, the time scale that we have to be able to limit temperatures below 1.52 degrees, simply do not allow us to say that the market is going to be the answer. In fact, Nicholas Stern, who is himself a classic economist, says, you know, climate change is the biggest single failure of the free market. And we've seen where we are as a consequence of the failure of the free market. You need control, public control, institutional control of the energy system to be able to transition it. You need the similarly public control of the food system, the second biggest emitter of emissions. And of course, the reality that we've still got 2 billion people who have issues of access or issues of hunger, whether it's the millions of people using food banks now increasingly in the global north, or the millions or the billions of people in the global south, the same half the world that is denied access to energy or denied access to food. So when we think about all of those, it actually leads us to an interesting space, because how you frame, I think, the climate and climate solutions brings us very much into all of our existing fights, right? From warm homes to living wages to public housing to universal public service to energy and food. So our transition fight becomes a very, very different transition fight. So of course, it is also about union jobs in the renewable energy sector. Of course, we want good union jobs, but it's much more than that, because it's now simply not about, do those workers have a right to join the trade union? It's who controls that industry to be able to deliver the transition. Where will the investment of that come from? Is it going to be simply about for profit? Is that the primary goal going to be profit, or is the primary goal going to be people's well-being? Now, Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, you know, said very clearly, said we've created a word of climate apartheid, where the rich will use their wealth to seek safety and leave the poor to burn or dry. Now, increasingly, that poor, as we're seeing, is not simply the poor in the global south, it's increasingly also the poor in the global north as well. So it leads us to the third question. So how do we build power then? Well, how do you change the world? And of course, as War on One, you know, as a workers' rights organization, social justice organization, we'd say you have to, the only way we're going to win is if you build a movement of movements that begins to connect these different issues together. The environment movement by itself, no matter how radical it is, will never, ever be able to win against this system unless it also recognizes where are organized forces. And of course, that means the trade union movement in its formal sense, but it also means working people in the informal sense. The other institutions, as we know, many of those have been hollowed out in the global north, but exist, of course, continue to exist in terms of in the global south. And we see the reality of also those changes, right? And I think some of it, sometimes I think we'll be a bit despondent because, of course, we look at what's happening in the UK and we go, oh my God, everything's terrible. And we look at Chile for a moment, when where a struggle around a subway price increase became a struggle against neoliberalism. You'll probably remember the slogan, this is not about 30 cents, this is about 30 years of neoliberalism. And when the new government was elected, they said the cradle of neoliberalism will become the graveyard of neoliberalism. And we see the similar in Colombia, where new forces bringing environmental, labor, feminist and racial justice organizations has propelled a progressive movement to power, who said climate and inequality are its ultimate goals. The one thing, when you look at the IPCC and when it released its report last year, it said, but very headline, change is now inevitable. What we're now fighting for is what kind of change. That's going to happen. And we already know, of course, from the forces of the right, what that looks like. It simply looks like this, but in a more weaponized form. It's walls and fences, it's more securitization. And of course, it's an acceptance that large parts of the world will continue to be sacrificed. And so the only answer to that is a very important one, which brings us back to class. When we talk about solidarity and cooperation, for me, coming from my class background, that word solidarity, where is that word most expressed? It's expressed, of course, in I think the vocabulary of the working class. It's a verb. It's not something that is just about a political idea. It's also about how communities exist, how communities forge bonds between each other, the idea of solidarity. And of course, that solidarity, as we've heard, it's been expressed in many, many different ways. So what's our story forth? Well, absolutely, the only answer to this is public luxury and private sufficiency. It's a fundamental altering of the economy, right? So I'm very much, I believe in the degrowth of the global north economy for all the very reasons that we cannot continue to extract and exploit the global south. But the idea isn't to say to working people, this is about less. Actually, this is about better. And when we look at it, even from a climate point of view, the top 1%, the top 1%, they are predicted to consume 75% of the carbon budget for 1.5. So already from a class perspective, we know, of course, there's the fair share, not just between the North and the South, but within the North is very, very different between who is most responsible, right? And it's, of course, not ordinary people who are overwhelmingly responsible. And they're not overwhelmingly responsible because they go on a week holiday to Spain, right? It's actually the private jets. It's the people, the 75% of flights that's taken by the 1% who are the most responsible. So we have to tell a very, very different story, right? A different story that actually, from a class perspective, this is a fight about our class finally winning the 100-year or 200-year fight that we've been fighting for, which is about the right to be able to live with dignity. That's why as War on Want, we call for a radical global Green New Deal that looks at those four, has those key principles within it. And I just want to also just say something, because John just mentioned about climate refugees. Look, the reality of climate refugees, and I don't particularly like that word, is, we are seeing climate displacement, violent climate displacement. The overwhelming majority of those people, probably about 99% of those people, are going to be displaced internally within a country or to a neighboring other poor country. We see that, of course, in normal refugee patterns, and the idea that there's going to be a mass of people coming from the global south to the global north is simply palpably, one, not true. And secondly, if that ever did occur, we'd be machine gunning them in the Mediterranean, just as we are now when with the Frontier X, when we're pushing boats back into the Mediterranean, where we've criminalized rescue boats going. All these predictions, which people said would never happen within liberal Western democracy in Europe, you know, these were beyond we were in an enlightened continent. Well, Joseph Borrell, who's the European Union's chief, I'm going to call him the foreign ministry. He's the guy, the Commission's representative on foreign affairs. You know, a few months ago did a speech and he said, you know, Europe is a garden. Outside of the garden is the jungle. Our role is to be the gardener of the jungle and prevent the jungle from entering our garden. And that, you know, to me, still speaks to that same arc of 500 years, right? It's exactly that logic of racialized capitalism. That's why this is not just an important theoretical debate about class and about how vulnerability it amplifies all those injustices, existing inequalities that exist, and also reinforces them on vulnerabilities. Actually, it's a fundamental way to understand this moment of permanent crisis and what our solutions and our strategies for building power and the fights that we need to have. I think I probably spoke for more than 10 minutes now. I'm sorry, so I'll shut up.
No, you're all right. Great stuff, Asad. Yeah, as always, there's plenty to dive into there. Let's have a look at the chat, see if there's any questions that have come in. Let's have a little look there. I think there's a good one there. So I know, yeah, we talked about how obviously unions need to get involved in all this, and sort of probably they need to be the ones pushing this as well. Yeah, someone's asked there, who's going to start talking to the unions and how we're going to do it? I think that's a good question. And we'll maybe take one or two more there, just to keep it going. There was another one there. There we go. I think that's a good one by Norman there as well. Does ownership matter? Simple question, yes. But maybe if anyone wants to elaborate a bit on that, that would be wonderful. And I think we'll take this final one by Joe here. What are your thoughts on Just Stop Oil? Yeah, I think if anyone wants to jump at any of them, feel free. Don't jump up at once.
I can jump in with the Just Stop Oil one.
Nice.
My issue with it is that it doesn't do anything to challenge like the source of this power. They're effectively pleading to people, you know, with a gun to their head to save their lives, and this only ever happens in the movies. They're not challenging that capital. All they're essentially doing is performative expressions of discontent. And, you know, I appreciate that, you know, we all different ways of, you know, showing how we're angry, but from an objective point of view, it does nothing. And, you know, it was once worthwhile in terms of raising awareness. Grassroots movements are integral to that, but we know enough now that we need to be going directly to the source, challenging that. How exactly that's done is a whole different conversation, and I don't want to hijack the rest of this, so I'll leave that there for now. But yeah, don't love them.
No, listen, that's great. My own thoughts on Just Stop Oil are probably very close to Emma, a bit like Extinction Rebellion or the climate strikes. You know, make them real strikes. You know, they should be going to the financial, the business, the insurance companies that are actually funding ecocide, rather than engaging often in counterproductive, sometimes anti-working class, you know, forms of mobilization. And I think it's because they lack a class analysis. I've not really ever seen Just Stop Oil explicitly call for an anti-capitalist, you know, alliance with trade unions. And that's the other issue. Somebody asked about trade unions. I mean, we should all be members of trade unions. They're a pain in the arse. Speaking as somebody who's very involved in my own trade union, they don't often work the way you'd want them to. But we do need to have fighting trade unions. And that's why all praise Mick Lynch You know, I think he's given a much needed shot in the arm to the trade union movement in terms of showing political activism. But it is hard because we are in a struggle. You know, I think we just need to recognize that it is a struggle and get used to it. But it is to see that there are, you know, there's slogans that, you know, we're a bit too trite, but they're also quite true. There's no jobs on a dead planet. I mean, this is a working class struggle. It's not for just scientists or the guilty educated middle class, because it's, as Asad was mentioning, it's the working class around the world that are going to suffer. They're already suffering. They have been suffering for hundreds of years from imperial racialized capitalism, and they're continuing to do so. So this is inextricably a class issue, which makes it then a trade union issue, which were set up to defend the working class against the capitalist state. So I do think also ownership does matter, because ownership then gives control. I understand there was a particular example that was given in the chat about a Scottish island, so I don't know the details of that, but certainly from work that I've done on why is there, certainly across the island of Ireland, I can't speak for Great Britain, but one of the biggest barriers to the development of onshore wind is not technical, it's local communities objecting. And these communities are not climate deniers, but they're saying, why should our area be effectively colonized? And this is the language they're using, by corporations for private profit. So I think actually even in just that energy transition, if ordinary people can own and control at least some, if not all, of the asset and get benefit from it, we would actually get more support for the green transition. And on the issue of the just transition that's been mentioned there, I think we also need to include care work. We need to also not just see work in terms of formally paid manual or office labor or working in a health setting and so on. It's also the care work often is very gendered. It's often quite racialized, lowly paid, if even paid at all. And the last point I'd make about the importance of talking about care workers as well as workers is it shows the idiocy of this neoclassical economic model, in that if a homeowner marries their male housemaid, GDP goes down. The same work is going to be done, just that now it's switched from being, you know, an exchange on the market to a non-exchange in terms of not money changing hands. So I do think we have to realize that we are, it's a battle for ideas as much as it's a battle for material interests as well.
So let me take the stop oil question first, because I suppose I'm not so critical of stop oil, largely because I've been part of this climate movement for so long, where we were raging and movements in the global south were saying, where are the movements in the global north? Where is the climate movement in the global north? And so I remember when Extinction Rebellion first took Westminster Bridge in their first mobilization, and folks who were in movements in the global south said, great, finally, look, people in the UK are taking to the streets. But rightly, they then said, but it's not roads and bridges which are killing us, it's the banks and corporations. Surely should be targeting that. And I think there has been a genuine evolution of the movement. It's of course not quite where we want it to be, but it's dramatically very, very different from where we are now, with Extinction Rebellion now having XR trade union group in it. I think recognize the importance of intersectionality, both not just as a theory, but in terms of practice. And for stop oil, look, you know, I absolutely, look, I'm not going to attack the tactics, because the tactic of disruption have been part and parcel of left movements historically. Absolutely, from a friendly perspective, critique and say, if you're going to slow down roads, those should not be in working class areas. We should be slowing down the roads in the City of London. We should be slowing down the roads in the Canary Wharf. We should be disrupting the economic centers of neoliberalism, of the fossil fuel industry. And of course, you know, they are doing that. Now, the counter argument Stop Oil would make is, well, there won't be a conversation about climate if they weren't out doing these disruptions. So I think there has to be a plurality of tactics, but there has to be a framework and understanding of us of where we're going for goals and what our goal and ultimate vision is. And I think this is where I suppose the wider ecology of our movement still lacks that coherent, cohesive frame of what are we trying to end and what are we trying to fight for? Is it just ending fossil fuels, or is it actually a fight for something else? And we all know that it's important to have the no, but it's the yes that is the transformative, right? It's the vision of the future that is ultimately is the transformation. And we saw that anyway. We don't have time, but we could go through social movements through history and talk about that. Ownership fundamentally matters. Look, you know, if you have any experience, and I come from Lancashire, where we've seen, in Berlin, where we see, you know, massive deindustrialization, right? And we're talking about a change in the economy, both at a national level and a global level. Of course, if you're working class, you're going to say, we know how that goes. We get shat upon, right? Ownership is fundamental in terms of winning sports, the social license for the change, but it's also very, very fundamental in ensuring that there is a just transition. Who owns it determines what the priorities of that transition are. Is it simply about transitioning a material throughput, or is it actually about transitioning an economy-wide or a sectoral transition? And what does that begin to look like? In next week, as we're on what we're publishing a report on transition of the garment sector from the perspective of garment sector workers in the global south, who are saying, hold on a minute, you're talking about transitions. We're still fighting for living wages and basic worker protections. And and people are talking about how you transition the fashion sector. And if it's not done fairly and equitably, of course, what we're going to see is people in the global north say, well, we need to buy less. And of course, workers in the global south being thrown out on their ear and left destitute. And we saw that, of course, during the COVID pandemic. We saw what the reality of disruption to supply chains without this question of ownership being at the center, and therefore equitable and the equitable distribution of its wealth and its resources. If you don't answer that, we are going to see an unjust transition. I think that Minaj has put a question, or was making a comment in terms about the Eurocentricness of movements in the global north, and I think that's also true about the trade union movement in the global north, right? And even in the UK. Now, I'm a proud trade unionist. I believe everybody should join a trade union. It's our form of collective power, etc. But there has been a tradition within global north trade unions that, first of all, have seen themselves as basically being in the part of the compact that what we're fighting for is redistribution of what the wealth that comes from an exploitative system for the benefit of workers only within either the sector that they represent or the economy wide in the global north, and largely ignoring the call of workers in the global south. This moment of crisis requires them to go beyond the nation state, right? I always say the banners of our trade union movement don't say workers of England unite, they say workers of the world unite, right? And I think bringing that internationalism and that class consciousness which goes beyond the nation state is an integral part of what we need to do with the trade union movement. Secondly, you know, somebody asked, what are we doing with the trade unions? As part of the Climate Justice Coalition, we're working with workers across all the trade unions in building like workers' power within those trade unions to call for more radical demands. Because I think at the moment, you know, you see an uneven, absolutely RMT, brilliant public ownership of transport, public ownership, the unions calling for universal public services, but they're still only looking very, very limited at key points and thinking about what does that mean in terms of jobs protection, where clearly the economy of the future isn't about simply protecting what we have. It's about a building economy, and that overwhelmingly is going to be about the care economy. That overwhelmingly is going to be about people who are not currently unionized or the lowest unionized or sectors of our society. Of course, it's going to be health, it's going to be education, it's going to be care. And so unions also have to reimagine themselves in terms of the future. And I think that's part and parcel of this fight. How do we protect what we've got now, but also win the fight in terms of on the transition? Look, I think Minaj also asked a question about the left in the global south. I'd say it's the same criticism that I would have of coming from the left in the global north. For a long time, the left in the global north had the same dissonance as the right about climate change. Climate was this middle-class environmental thing. It was over there. It wasn't anything to do with us. We were only interested in material fights. Actually, there's a large part of our movements in the global south that always understood that this was a fight overwhelmingly about justice. But now increasingly, many of the left movements in the global south recognize that actually what the fight, this climate fight is the same anti-imperialist, anti-colonial fight that many of them been involved in for a very long time. And what we're fighting for is actually both at a national and a global level, a fundamental argument about both economic sovereignty, challenge of the current global economic system, and all of the demands that we make. And in fact, in a week, 2 weeks time, that we're helping host a meeting of Asian trade unions and social movements, talk about what does a transition fight look like within Asia, because it's very different, of course, in a national context and in a regional context. Now, if you look at Latin America, there's a much stronger tradition there of eco-socialism, or that coming up, that's saying the new pink tide can't simply be about control of materials, right? About what profit comes from controlling those materials. We have to also think deeper in terms of what does a post-extractive economy look like? Not simply about how and who controls the exploitation or extraction of those resources, but actually how do we manage those resources and for what purpose, and what is needed. And of course, in the global south, we need a massive expansion, investment. They have to use way more resources to be able to bring up living standards, to strengthen their economies, to strengthen their resilience as both people and as countries. So I think we're probably at a moment where, at least I see the threads all there, right? The opportunities all there. What the challenge now is to be able to weave them together and tell a very different story, one that is both global and national and local, but at its heart is anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, and recognizes the centrality of the class. And when I talk about class, I always talk race, gender, class. It's not simply class in its economic determinist way.
Amazing, great responses there. I don't think now everyone's coming up with the amazing deep questions now, and I'd love to go into these. Maybe we need to do part 3. Maybe we need to do another one at some point. But yeah, I think we should maybe wrap up there. Don't want to keep these too long. I think for me, maybe I'll just ask one little thing for me. Obviously, do you remember when we were speaking about sort of the climate crisis and cost of living crisis and all this? It can be very, I think, daunting for a lot of people, thinking maybe make people feel very apprehensive or like everything's so bad. What can be done? So like maybe one little thing from each of you before we go. What positive thing do you see happening, or like you can see us getting to in the future that gives people a bit of hope leaving this call?
Well, maybe I'll start. I mean, to me, I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful. And what I mean by that is that optimism is the kind of happy idea that technology, the state is going to make it fine. We have this great saying in Ireland which exemplifies this kind of naive optimism. We say it'll be grand. Now, I do not believe it's going to be grand. So we don't need this kind of optimism. But what we do need is hope. But hope requires agency, as I think everybody who's spoken tonight has said. But also we have to be aware that for it to be genuinely hopeful, we have to at least countenance, a struggle, that we can't outsource this. So to me, that's where hope comes from, is true agency. And I think what Asad was getting at there towards the end of what he was saying is going to be so important. The unlikely alliances, Emma talked about cross-class alliances that you find in elements of the climate movement. I think they're going to be important going forward. But also then international solidarity with La Via Campesina, for example, or the peasants' movements. I mean, one example which completely bypassed most of the Western media, the world's single biggest trade union activist strike was in India, where millions of farmers went on strike. So I do think we have to begin to see these alliances, and particularly connecting, as I say, things like decarbonisation and greenhouse gas emission reduction with things like the unfinished legacies of decolonisation?
I'm happy to go next if you want, Emma, or do you want to go next?
I can go. It's always hard to tell who's going to start talking over these things. So I'd say for me, it's especially in the last 6 months, actually since May, since the Beyond Growth conference in Brussels, for some reason what happened is there was this like magical thing where like this explosion of conversation about class started coming up. And people were very critical about degrowth, about post-growth, the working class. But instead of just becoming like very polemical, people say, okay, well, what can we do? And what I'm starting to see just from all different spheres, like in the UK, global north, global south, is people are now starting to very rapidly build up networks through this shared struggle. And there's just this undying, relentless desire just to share like everything we have with each other. And I mean, I'm quite, a pessimist anyway. And we know we're up shit creek. There's no paddle. We're kind of screwed in that regard. But I would say this is the biggest sort of shift that I've certainly seen in a very long time. So yeah.
Actually, I'm very hopeful because I definitely don't feel that the right strategy is despair, because everything we do now, if we were just being in metrics, we'd say we can count this fight about how many lives and livelihoods will be safe from destruction, right? So there's an imperative on us not to be pessimistic, right, about this. This is a fight of all fights, a fight for humanity, fight for the very future. And it's a fight that you can't sit on the sidelines. And that is it for me, really interesting, because for a long time, the question about power, question about internationalism was largely absent from much of the discourse. And those are now fundamentally back, very center stage. And that lends us both as Emma said, this bigger question now where people are really starting to say, what are the frameworks? What are the solutions? What are the demands? And it's incredible, right? We are in a moment where actually you've got more and more movements thinking like, how do we work together around our shared objective, the movement to movement strategy? So I always take heart from this one quote, and it's from the architect of neoliberalism, Milton Friedman, when he said, only a crisis, real or perceived, produces change. And when he was speaking to his acolytes, he said, our goal is to keep our ideas and policies alive until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And absolutely, when you look at empirically at this crisis, what we are saying and what we're calling for is what is politically inevitable, is what is needed. Right. So our fight is not simply some abstract theoretical fight. It's a real lifeblood fight where we actually have an opportunity to make that call we had in anti-globalization, another world is possible, make it absolutely real.
Amazing, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Hopefully everyone's a bit energized after that. I know I definitely am. I think, and maybe just to go back to a little bit what John said originally, like that age-old adage of organise, educate, agitate. Do you know what I mean? I think we need to just get there doing it. Do you know what I mean? We can't wait for someone to come and save us. We have a world to win, so let's get to it. Thank you everyone for joining. Hopefully we're going to be doing a few more of these coming up in the next month and a half, so keep an eye out for those. We're going to have one on housing and class, and one on how poverty is portrayed in the media. So definitely keep in touch, and we'll let you know about them. If anyone wants to join, we can jump on our brand new website, snazzy looking, and get in contact with us there. We'd love to have as many of you as possible help us grow the Working Class Economist Group. I think we'll leave it there, and enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone.
I leave you with a quote from James Connolly, who said, "Our demands most modest are, we only want the earth."
Love a good Connolly quote, especially that one. All the best, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Niall. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Good evening, everybody.